Hello, welcome everybody. My name is Gavin Jones. I'm the chair of the Stanford English Department and I'm affiliated with the Bill Lane Center for the American West. So it's a great pleasure to be hosting this event today. I also wrote a book about John Steinbeck a couple of years ago, so this subject matter is of deep interest to me, to us both. It's a real pleasure to introduce Iris Jamahl Dunkle today. She is an award-winning poet, biographer, and member of the National Book Critics Circle Board. Her poetry and nonfiction critically engage with the Western myth of progress by exploring the profound impact of agriculture and overpopulation on the North American West, both historically and in contemporary times. Embracing an eco-feminist perspective, her writing challenges the predominantly male-centric narrative of the American West's recorded history, delving into the often overlooked lives of women. Dunkle earned her MFA in poetry from New York University and her PhD in American literature from Case Western Reserve University. She is the author of 2 biographies, Charmian Kittredge London, Trailblazer Author Adventurer, which came out from the University of Oklahoma Press in 2020, and of course, Riding Like the Wind, The Life of Sanora Babb, published just last year from the University of California Press. In addition, she has published 4 collections of poetry, including West Fire Archive, published by the Center for Literary Publishing, Interrupted Geographies, and Gold Passage by Trio House Press, and There's a Ghost in This Machine of Air by WordTech. Dunkle curates Finding Lost Voices, a weekly blog dedicated to resurrecting the voices of women who have been marginalized or forgotten. She has garnered recognition through awards and fellowships from esteemed institutions such as Biographers International, Millay Arts, and Vermont Studio Center, and her writing has appeared in publications such as Orion, Electric Lit, Liber, Pleiades, Tin House, Calyx, Fence, and the Los Angeles Review, and Split Rock Review. Notably, her work was featured on the Academy of American Poets Poem of a Day series and showcased on 100 buses during the Muni Art 2020 campaign. So Iris is here this afternoon to discuss her latest work, as I mentioned, Riding Like the Wind, The Life of Sanora Babb. So please join me in welcoming her.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's my first time actually being on the Stanford campus. I know, so I don't know how that happened, but it's my first time here. Before I begin and tell you a little bit about Sanora Babb, I just want to say that all of the readings that I'm doing on my tour, I'm dedicating to a woman named Joanne Deerkop, who was the literary executor for Sanora Babb. And it's because of her that Sanora Babb's books are still in print to this day. She promised her friend Sanora over glasses of wine that she would keep her in print. This was in the late 1990s. And she's the reason why I was able to access a lot of these materials to create this biography. Sadly, she passed away in April of last year, but I was able to send her a copy of the manuscript before it was published. And in return, she sent me this beautiful coat, which is Sanora Babb's coat. So I wear it. This is the coat, yes. Yes. So I wear it in honor of both Joanne and Sanora Babb. And this bracelet is also Sanora Babb's bracelet, given to me by Sanora Babb's adopted daughter, Roxana, who blessed the biography. So Sanora Babb was born April 21st, 1907. This is her in Red Rock, Oklahoma. She was born in Leavenworth, Kansas, because her grandmother didn't want her to be born in a territory. Oklahoma was not yet a state. But this is an early picture of her and her father, Walt. And then this is Sanora on the far left as the baseball mascot for the Red Rock semi-professional baseball league. Her father was a gambler who spent most of his time either playing baseball or at the Yellow Dog Saloon, pictured on the left, in Red Rock. Red Rock was on the edge of the Oto-Missouri territory, and that meant that Sonora often spent a lot of time with the Missouri Oto people, and it's where she would go to seek refuge from her troubled home, because her father was quite abusive to her mother. In 1907, they moved to eastern Colorado, and they lived in a dugout, farming broom corn. This is on the left. That little tiny house you see is just the top of a dugout. And that's the first crop of broom corn, the only successful crop that they had. And on the right, you can see both Sonora and her sister Dorothy lived in a lot of, they lived without food for a long time. They would they would have health issues based on this long, the starvation they faced during this time. But after a few years trying to homestead in eastern Colorado, they moved to the booming town of Elkhart, Kansas. Right here, booming town, where Sonora was finally able to attend school. She was only able to learn reading from the walls of the dugout before that, where her mother pasted the pages of the Denver Post, and that's how she learned to read. So she got to go to school in Elkhart, and her first essay was called How to Handle Men, which kind of gives you a theme for where she was and where she spent most of her life. This is her and her sister Dorothy on their porch in Forgan, Oklahoma, where she attended high school. In the middle, they're dressed up like movie stars, and on the far left, that's the hotel where her father spent much of his time gambling in Garden City, Kansas. And it's there where she made a decision, where she was working at the newspaper, that she wanted to pursue a life as a writer. And she had her father gamble for her and flip a coin. Heads, she would go to New York. Tails, she would go to LA, landed on tails, and she started her life in Los Angeles. So I'm going to read you the introduction, and then we're going to go into conversation to talk about the life of Sanora Babb together. But I want to give you just kind of a sense of my way into this text. Introduction. I knew from a very young age that I wanted to be a writer. But when I was growing up in the 1970s and 80s in rural Northern California, I was rarely assigned women writers to read in class. Having grown up in the West, I've always been drawn to writers who wrote about the West. When I was assigned books by Jack London, John Steinbeck, and Wallace Stegner, I was mesmerized by how they wrote about the land on which I lived. Judging by their depictions of the West, as well as those presented in film and on television, however, someone like me, a woman, had little to do with the West, and we certainly had never received much acclaim for writing about it. My grandmother grew up in the panhandle of Oklahoma. She and her family were forced to leave their farm when dust storms destroyed their crops. It was a tough journey, one that would scar my grandmother with its trauma for the rest of her life. My grandmother was proud of her survival, but she didn't want to talk about it, and she most certainly didn't want others to tell her story for her. When I was in high school, we were assigned John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. After I read it, I rushed home to call my grandmother to tell her about it. "Grandma, did you know they wrote a book about us?" She told me Steinbeck got it wrong. She said he made her and her family look like helpless victims. She said not to ever mention the book again. For a long time, I was confused by my grandmother's reaction. Why was she so upset about this great author's work? How had Steinbeck gotten it wrong? In my schooling up to that point, I had been trained to prioritize the published fictional account written by Steinbeck, a man, over my grandmother's firsthand and, of course, more accurate real-life experience. I had no idea how right my grandmother's reaction was. When I first stumbled upon and read Sanora Babb's novel, Whose Names Are Unknown, written in the late 1930s while she was volunteering with the Farm Security Administration, which built resettlement camps up and down California, I was overwhelmed with emotion. I found mention of her book while I was watching Ken Burns' award-winning documentary, The Dust Bowl, which features extensive excerpts from Babb's notes and reports and showcases Babb's unique knowledge of the Dust Bowl and its victims. Burns introduces Babb as someone who, like the refugees, had grown up in the affected area around the Oklahoma Panhandle, sometimes called no man's land, and was deeply committed to, quote, establishing a trust and respect with the refugees that extended both ways. Babb's was a story that humanized the experiences of those who had suffered through one of the worst natural disasters the United States had faced up to that point. A version where we got to know the characters before the worst days of their lives, when they had to flee to California to find work, where we saw the lives of women and children through their own eyes, and where we saw Black, Mexican, and Filipino workers in the fields and organizing strikes side by side with whites. Here was a book that told a version of the Dust Bowl story that aligned with the one my grandmother had told me. Babb was a writer who reported the human truth. As her friend, the poet Anne Stanford, wrote about her work, she, quote, represents the truth about life, even in its rough beauty. By the time I finished reading Whose Names Are Unknown, I had become fascinated with Babb and knew that she had to be my next biographical subject. I had decided to write my first biography, Charmian Kittredge London, trailblazer, author, adventurer, about Jack London's wife, an amazing woman who disregarded gender norms, when I found out that she had helped write many of her husband's novels and had never been given credit for her work. That biography was used as a source for a remodel of the museum at Jack London State Historic Park, housed in Charmian's previous home, the House of Happy Walls. Now, when young girls visit the park, they will be introduced to two writers, Jack London and Charmian Kittredge London. This physical representation of my work has motivated me to commit my career to unearthing the stories of women who have been forgotten or misremembered. The more I learn, the more I research, the more I realize how many women have been erased, not only from the history of the West, but from human history. It's an arduous task to tell the story of a life. Babb hated writing biographical statements and was cautious of any biographer who wanted to take on the task of writing a biography about her husband, the Academy Award-winning cinematographer James Wong Howe. Thankfully, Babb left a wide trail of materials, mainly at the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas at Austin. Everything from the pair of beaded moccasins Chief Blackhawk gave her when she was a 5-year-old living in Red Rock, Oklahoma, to drafts of her novels, memoirs, poems, and short stories, to long letters to and from friends, to boxes and boxes of photographs. But while Babb could control what she left as her personal archive, she couldn't control how others would remember her. The word archive comes from the ancient Greek archeion, the house of the ruler. That means that what is placed in or what is left out of the archive is a political act. When you read the biographies of Babb's contemporaries, the novelists Ralph Ellison, William Saroyan, John Fonte, and Carlos Bulosan, whom she supported and who were her literary equals, you rarely see Babb's name mentioned. The omission of her name and of many of her contemporaries' names has had a lasting effect. Women's stories, especially those of women who were inspired by the likes of proto-feminists like Edna St. Vincent Millay to cast off the monogamous, heterosexual gender norms that had been placed on them, were written out of the record after World War II during the quote-unquote silent decade when women's lives were subjected to, quote, the isolation of suburban domesticity beneath a decorative facade of respectability and resentment. This, combined with the blacklisting that occurred during the Red Scare, left many once popular female leftist writers of the 1930s and 40s unpopular and at odds with gender norms. My research made me wonder, what would have happened if I had been assigned Babb's Whose Names Are Unknown in school, in addition to, or even instead of the grapes of wrath. Not only would I have seen my own family's experience within the history I was being taught, but I also would have been given an example of a foremother, a woman writer who was writing about the West. This biography aims to correct the record by returning to the archives with the intent of writing Sanora Babb's name back into the canon that has forgotten her. The Life of Sanora Babb teaches us something about how to better understand the story of the American West. Hers is the story of a strong woman who was not deterred by those who wished to tell her story for her, or by those who would not let her tell her own story. This biography challenges the set canon of the American West by adding Babb's name to that elite and ever-growing list. Thank you.
Thank you, Iris, for that introduction and for this wonderful book, which I spent the weekend reading. And I have some questions for you about the book itself, and then I have a few thoughts and questions about Sanora Babb's life that we could kind of get into a little bit more detail about. And then I had some sort of reflections on Steinbeck's role in the project and Babb's relationship to Steinbeck. But yeah, I was so curious about, you know, your life as a poet and your life as a scholar and biographer. We had an event actually in this room at lunchtime in which we were discussing some of the ways that the division between the critical and the creative is kind of breaking down, and how we shouldn't really be thinking of, you know, creative practice and critical analysis as necessarily opposed. So I wonder, like, if you could just reflect a little bit on, well, I don't even want to call them two sides of your identity, because perhaps they're not two sides. I mean, what are those relationships for you?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I do identify as a poet first.
Mm-hmm.
That's the genre I began writing in first, and I published in first, and I got my MFA in. But I have always been drawn to research, and all of my poetry is in conversation with the archives. So the melding of these two genres came quite naturally, and it came because when I was working on my book Westfire Archive, which is my latest poetry collection, but it takes 10 years to write a poetry collection, so this is 10 years ago, and or 12 years ago, and I was in the archives at the Huntington Library reading Charmian Kittredge London's diaries about their trip on the Dirigo, which is this three-masted ship that she and Jack London were crew on. They paid to be crew on, that sailed around from Baltimore around Cape Horn to Seattle. And reading her journals, which were fascinating and beautiful, I saw evidence that she had helped write Valley of the Moon, which is a book that I grew up reading. And I loved Jack London as a writer because he could write such a strong female protagonist. So when I found out that actually Charmian had written that protagonist, I was shocked. And I also found, I started finding these research questions like that, and going to scholars like Earl Labor, who wrote one of the best, the most famous biographies about Jack London, and asking why we didn't know more about Charmian. And even the photograph on the cover of his book is a picture of Jack London on horseback on Sonoma Mountain. And I asked him if he knew that Charmian had taken that photograph, and he said, no, I never really thought to ask that question. And so in that space of I never really thought to ask that question, I kind of realized that I did. In my poetics, I asked those questions. I wanted to know who took those photographs, who was missing from the story of Jack London and from all these other stories. And in in all reality, if I wrote a book of poems, the audience would be a much smaller audience to, engage with that text. And so I chose to pursue Charmian's life in biography. And it was a long, arduous task. But then I was hooked.
Yeah.
And I will be writing biography and poetry for the rest of my life.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it is one thing that creative writers and scholars have in common. They both do research, right?
Yeah.
I have a number of colleagues in our department in the creative writing program who are really research-heavy scholars. It's at the very foundation of their writing, and I'd love to have a panel someday thinking about the different ways that scholars and writers sort of do research.
It is different.
And so, well, that's my next question. So, you know, have you developed a kind of research methodology? Has it changed over time? How do you work in the archive, right? I've used archives and I find them exhausting and overwhelming, and you know, I realize I'm not a historian because I don't have the patience to kind of just face and plow through what you have to. So like what's your method then when you're confronting an archive?
So when I confront, and I do want to say I confront it not just in the archive, because when you're telling stories of women that have been forgotten, they're not often in one set archive the way you would some other figures or subjects. But the first way I approach someone like Sanora Babb is to understand the places where she lived. So I had never been to Eastern Colorado, and so I went on a road trip there, met the people that owned the land where her dugout had been, and drove out there, literally laid on the dirt so I could smell the dirt, so I could smell what the air smelled like. I could hear the wild geese traveling overhead. I could step on buffalo grass to hear what it feels like when you step on it. That kind of, I think as a poet, I have to have that full sensory experience in order to write scenes. But when I go to the archive, and that means going to somewhere like the Harry Ransom Center, where I spent a great deal of time, I come in with a list of research questions, and they thankfully would let me take in my big old notebook, and I found it to be like a treasure hunt. You know, that's the way I perceive archival research. Yes, it's long and boring, and there's never enough funding to stay there long enough, and it's this battle always. But the way that you start adding things to your timeline, you start expanding the story, and you find that through line. And it is the most amazing feeling in the world to kind of find someone's hidden life and bring it to life. And a lot of the research is also done at these little tiny historical societies, you know, in these small towns that I would visit. And the people working there were so excited that I wanted to know the history of Red Rock, you know, and they'd be like, oh, my girlfriend did some work 20 years ago, and here's this thing that they, you know, and I'd have to find the sources to solidify all it. But it was the combination of all of those fields that made it possible for me to kind of net the story of Sanora Babb's life and bring it to life. Because for me, it's really important. You know, you say the difference between a scholar and a creative writer. The important thing for me is that the people reading the book are engaged in the story and want to continue reading, right, because I'm trying to bring her back to life. Yeah. So my focus is not fact. It's fact with story embedded in it. Yeah. So I think that's the difference, is that I'm not there to just show the facts that I've found. I'm there to tell the story.
Yeah, and there is definitely the spirit of a life in the book. It reads, there's a kind of breathless quality, and you know, the pace I found just at one with this sort of breathless life that she led. But I wonder, were there any difficult areas or any moments where, you know, things were cutting across the grain, or you weren't finding what you were looking for? Because it all reads of a piece, you know, it kind of falls open in that way. But then I wonder, you know, is that disguising moments of difficulty, and how you kind of overcame them when you were writing the book?
Oh yeah, there's lots of moments of difficulty in telling the story of a life. I think some of the areas that were very difficult were, for example, I could not travel to Ukraine to do the research I needed to do about when she traveled there in the 1930s. I couldn't kind of trying to untangle the story of the Red Scare and how it affected James Wong Howe and how he was graylisted, and finding all the FBI files, and that was difficult during some of the administrations that were in power, and so there's a lot of detailed information that were difficult to get to, and I had to collaborate with other scholars, and a lot of it was, also getting to the people you wanted to interview. That's the other thing is, they see you as who are you writing this story, and so you have to build this relationship with them. And I couldn't even go into Sanora Babb's house because the person who lives there is very private, and they didn't want me in the house, but I could go outside and take photographs, So there's just a lot of things like that where I'd have to recreate it through stories that Roxana, her adopted daughter, would tell me, and photographs she showed me of, she'd literally piece together rooms with photographs to show me what it looked like.
Yeah, that's interesting, because when your method is so place-centered, it presupposes that you're going to have access to those places, and then if you can't have access to those places, it's you need to find other ways, I guess, to get at that material. Yeah. So why don't we get into some of these places and moments in Sanora Babb's life, because place and setting so important in the way that you tell this story, just as the characters and the people are so important in this story as well. I learned such a lot from this, just about the literary history of the 1940s, 1930s, 40s and 50s. I mean, it's really a literary history at some level. But I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about Babb's early life. You touched on it in your introduction. I remember driving through when we drove west. I came from the East Coast when I arrived at Stanford, and we did the middle route. We went like route sort of 70, I guess it was, through Kansas, and I remember eastern Colorado, and I wasn't expecting it to look like it. I was expecting
so flat.
It's so flat and kind of sort of bleak. I mean, no offense to anybody from eastern Colorado, but I was expecting the mountains immediately, and then as soon as you get to Denver, it all changes, right? But maybe you could paint a little bit of a picture of her early life, because it is a kind of Western experience that very different from Steinbeck's Western experience. I mean, he grew up in a middle-class, wealthy household, surrounded by the trappings of culture, but she was living in a hole in the ground, like literally, and as you mentioned, was learning to read from, we've all seen the, Walker Evans photographs of houses with the newspapers as wallpaper on the wall and so forth. But that was her literary culture, right? Quite literally. And so maybe you could get into like how that formed her as a person, how it maybe deformed her as a person.
Yeah, I think it's really important to know that her what she read as a child was literally the Adventures of Kit Carson, which was actually, Kit Carson was illiterate, and that was written by someone else, but and the Denver Post newspapers that were plastered to her wall. And her grandfather, Conkey, who she was really close with, was the one who was teaching her how to read and telling her not to read the stories about like the bank robbery, but of course she read them. And he would take her on walkabouts across, the flat plains, the high plains. And part of the reason why I had to go there was because she thought it was so beautiful. When she wrote, she was always haunted by eastern Colorado. She wrote about it in her memoir, An Owl on Every Post. She wrote about it in Whose Names Are Unknown. It was actually originally set there. She wrote about it again and again in short stories, and she just couldn't let that place go. And so for me to understand, because I didn't expect eastern Colorado to be so flat, and I didn't expect it to be also beautiful. Like when I actually got there and saw what it was like, and the way the horizon bends, and it's it's a beautiful land that people love. And it's still cut into the same lines that the prospector, like the people who were homesteading, the same plots are there. Like it's really wild. But when she lived there, they struggled a great deal. Her father was a gambler. He bought the homestead instead of proving up. And so when they couldn't, farm, they lost their homestead. And so they ended up living in another place on Horse Creek and trying to make ends meet. And it didn't work out. And they would literally go weeks drinking red pepper tea as a way to trick their bodies that they were full, but they were starving to death. And everyone in their family had heart trouble the rest of their lives,
right.
From those days. So when they did move to Elkhart, she was very excited to go to school, but they were always ostracized, whatever community they were in, because of her father's gambling. And even though all the men of the town were going to gamble with her father, nobody wanted to hang out with the gambler's daughter or the gambler's family. And so when they moved to Forgan, Oklahoma, running from the police, she went to high school there and became valedictorian. Yet she didn't receive that. She went up on the stage and was supposed to receive that award, and her name wasn't called because a group of women had decided that it wasn't right to have a gambler's daughter be named valedictorian, and they took that away from her. And it was devastating to her. So she knew what it was like to be othered.
Right.
It really gave her this compassion for other people that is unprecedented. I mean, it makes sense, like, after you understand her childhood, why she made the choices she did and who she hung out with in her life, because you understood where her empathy came from. It came from experience.
Yeah, to sort of overcome the impoverishment of your childhood to become valedictorian and then have that erased by the institution must be devastating.
Yeah.
And, Walt, the father figure, I became kind of obsessed with him. Could be a sort of figure from a Mark Twain novel, or I don't know, just such a complicated character, right? Like violent, abusive, yet sort of, I don't know, so like just wanting to teach kids how to play baseball.
Yeah.
And he was a con man, basically, right? He would mark cards and he would, win money from, passers-by. He's in that sort of tradition of the kind of Western confidence man.
Yeah.
And she stayed sort of in touch with him more or less, right? Through his, he moves to San Diego, is that right? So maybe you could say a little bit more about Walt, because obviously, he had this horrible, violent side, but I don't want to say I found him a sympathetic figure, because I didn't.
Good.
but I also, he wasn't like, you don't completely demonize him though,
No.
He's sort of, it's like what's that phrase the feminist critic Nina Baim uses about American literature, the melodrama of beset manhood, right? Like there's this sort of privileging of his. I'm not saying you privilege it more than it should be. You don't, but maybe you could just talk us through some of your, because you must have had very emotional reactions to Walt as you were recording his character, but also kind of inhabiting it at some level and creating it for us.
Definitely.
Because he lives and breathes in the book.
That's good, because he was right there the whole time while I was writing it. And the reason why is because, Sonora and her father were very close. They were very similar, and that's why they butted heads all the time. She wrote about him, so after Whose Names Are Unknown was not published, which we'll talk about, she wrote another novel, The Lost Traveler, which was, in early drafts, was based fully on her father. And she wrote very clearly about his abuse. And the publishers at Random House, her editors were like, this isn't believable. Nobody acts like this. And it was devastating to her that she was finally like telling the story of her abuse, and the editors were like, nobody's going to believe Walt, and so she, from that point on, she kind of made it a much milder story. And you see that in all of her other writing about Walt up, after that point. And so when I went into this project, I thought Walt was like, he was a bad guy. He gambled, he played baseball, complicated guy, whatever. But when I actually, because of the way she wrote about him, he was okay, But when I actually did the research and found the hidden stories about him and how he abused his wife, who he married at 15, she was 15 and he was 25, and the physical abuse, the verbal abuse, it was really, really devastating. And the fact that after Sanora Babb finally told that story, and to have it be shut down, in her novel, it made me realize why she had so many health issues after that. She literally suffered a heart attack after her father died.
Right, when she was 45, is that right?
Yeah, and that had a lot to do with the stress of that trauma.
Right. Yeah, that comes sort of later in the book, those details of when she gets a letter from her mother, right, who describes some of that violence and some of that abuse. So even though it's present throughout, it's interesting how it comes a little later in the story and sort of reflects back on all of that. And he was, he was a baker as well, right? I mean, he had these moments when and he was very good at it, and he was very good at marking cards, and he was a very good gambler, and he had this skill, and I guess taught Sanora certain things, right?
Yeah, she learned how to mark cards from him.
Right.
I mean, he was losing his sight because he was in his, he was doing this fine work, and so he had her mark the cards for him in Garden City.
Yeah, right. So this figure of craft and hard work is also then at the same time this figure of destruction and abuse, and both of those things are sort of held together.
And he was really smart. He was a really smart guy, and they met in their intelligence, but he just had this addiction.
Yeah, right. No, that comes across so well in the book. It's also a very kind of Western story in that she trains as a printer's devil, rather like Twain himself and other many figures in American literature kind of have that training, and she works as a journalist in a newspaper office.
Run by women.
Run by women, yeah. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that. It's it's not a massive chapter in the book at least, but I think a very important one in terms of her development.
Yeah, after the Otoe-Missouri people who gave her shelter in Red Rock, the place she found shelter was the newspaper office. Mm-hmm. And beginning in Elkhart, on into Forgan, and then again in Garden City, she worked for the newspapers, and they were often run by women. And for her whole life, the sound of a newspaper office was the place she would go to find comfort. It was just a place where she knew that she could find a job, she could find community. It was the thing she would, if she was even when she was hitchhiking back across the country after being at the Writers' Congress in 1935, she stopped in Salt Lake City at the newspaper office to get some work so she could make some money to get home, because she knew she could copy edit somewhere.
Right. Yeah. No, that kind of itinerant, that skill that you can take from place to place and come back to if you need to. So
yeah, I think it's it's not well documented what a large role that women played in the newspaper offices of especially in the Panhandle area.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I did not know about that. Yeah. And then the other place that's so important in this book is LA, right? She arrives in what, 29, 30?
1929. Not a great year for the stock market.
Not a great year, but LA kind of develops in the 1920s, right? And so she's arriving at a time when the city is sort of cresting, I guess, and is there through the 1930s, very closely connected to Hollywood. so it's so fascinating to learn that that was decided on like the flip of a coin or the roll of a dice, right? And you wonder what would, if she'd have gone to New York, what would the Sanora Babb New York edition, you know, be like? I mean, really.
Make a good Twilight Zone.
Yeah, it would. Even though, of course, she spends some time in New York as well. So maybe you could take us through. I was intrigued with her relationship with James Wong Howe, right? I learned a lot about him and his work, and I hadn't realized how, you know, important he is as a cinematographer, obviously. I mean, one of the leading figures of that generation. And she has this very long relationship with him. And that interested me because they kind of get closer in a way, right? Like, I mean, it's sort of counterintuitive. It's not like some love affair that untangles at the end. It's sort of a relationship that has sort of ups and downs and moments of support, moments of neglect, moments of frustration, moments of love, and there is a sort of a crescendo in the relationship, or at least that's how it comes across in the book. So maybe you could take us through that, because it's a kind of a interesting plot line, I think, that runs through a very eclectic life. That's probably the biggest constant, I think, in the book.
Yeah, well, you have to imagine that when Sanora Babb and James Wong Howe met, it was illegal for them to get married in California until 1940. Oh, I just looked up.
9, I think, was it?
1949. No. Yes, 1948.
48.
In
Okay.
1948 is when the laws lifted. So that meant that when they were dating, if they went to a restaurant in Hollywood, there would be all these empty tables, and Sanora would be like, "Can I get a table?" And they would be like, "I'm sorry, we don't have any tables for you." So they would end up having to go on dates in Chinatown. But when they would get serious, they couldn't live together, because in the contracts that Jimmy had with the studios, he was not allowed to date a white woman or to live with a white woman. And so it was really complicated. Add to that, they both had complicated backgrounds. Jimmy left China at age 5, left his mother at age 5, and dealt with incredible racism from that point on, fought tooth and nail to get into Hollywood, like literally jumped the fence on a set to get in there and make his way into Hollywood. And really had a wound there about his mother for a really long time, which made it difficult for him to connect with Sanora. At the same time that Sanora Babb had a very complicated relationship with her father. And she watched her mother suffer as a wife her entire life, and until she finally divorced. And then, she just didn't want to repeat that. And she wanted to be a writer, and she knew that if she got married, she would be a caretaker. She would have to take care of Jimmy, and she wouldn't be a writer. And so she fought against that. And then also she was quite independent and demanded more an open marriage, and I think Jimmy also demanded that as well. And so it was an area where it wasn't until literally they were able to get married, they were able to have a home together. He finally understood where she was coming from, that she was a writer and she needed her space to be a writer, that they were able to come together. And it meant that, the last years of their lives together, in the 60s and 1970s until he died in 1976, were really quite beautiful and intimate. And it's because of her that his collection is at the Margaret Herrick Library at the Academy, and that he is so revered in the film industry. It's not, obviously it's because of the work he did, but he's remembered because of her. And she did that at the sacrifice of her career. In 1970, her big hit book, An Owl in Every Post, which was a memoir about that time in eastern Colorado, came out, and it was widely received. And she stopped going on tour so she could take care of Jimmy.
Right, yeah. Like she nurses him literally for 5 years towards the end, right?
Yeah.
And and they run a Chinese restaurant together, which becomes
Xinghao.
Becomes a sort of hotspot for Hollywood stars. Cary Grant, and she was keeping the books, right, and really.
Well, Dorothy kept the books, but she managed the restaurant. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, maybe we could get into Dorothy a little bit then, because she's a fascinating figure and is a kind of sort of alter ego, like a kind of different. I mean, she suffered from mental illness and has a period of addiction and alcoholism, like her father, and. But at the same time was an extremely engaging person, right? And so maybe you could tell us a little bit about Dorothy. She's like a minor character in this story, but I think a significant character.
So Dorothy was 2 years younger than Sanora Babb, and Sanora felt like she had to take care of her sister, so she protected her from the violence of the family. And so after Sanora Babb moved to Los Angeles and established herself, she paid to have her sister take the train out and meet her there. And she tried to get her sister to get a degree at UCLA, and she failed out. She tried to get her sister to go to library school, and she failed out. So her sister was not, because of her mental health issues, was not able to complete tasks. But Sanora Babb took care of her sister to the detriment of her relationship with Jimmy, and her, she was her sister's caregiver. And it was a time when it was very difficult to treat mental illnesses like the one that Dorothy had, which is, I didn't go as far as to diagnose her because I don't have access to her full medical records and I am not a psychiatrist. But I do disclose some of the things that happened to Dorothy. And Dorothy was suicidal. She tried to commit suicide on several occasions, and Sanora Babb had to pay for her care throughout her life. Finally, Dorothy settled in Helmet, California, and was able to kind of get treated there and live a pretty stable life towards the end of her life. Right. But it took a lot of caretaking on Sanora Babb's part, and it was just in her nature to be that way. She was that way with her literary friends as well, and she was an editor. She would help her, in all her letters, she would give edits to all of her friends, like, some of her more famous writing group friends. I think that was just in her nature, and that's why she also cared for Jimmy, she cared about the people in her community, sometimes to the detriment of her writing career. Yeah.
Yeah, there are kind of a series of sort of happy endings in the book, and in a way the story itself has a happy ending. Right, with the publication, the deserved publication of whose names are unknown, and the recognition that she gets towards the end, and Dorothy's sort of recovery, and even the father has this sort of period in San Diego, which seems to be a sort of a reprieve of sorts. So, and the relationship with James Wong Howe as well kind of has this sort of happy ending, and so it kind of coincidence, I suppose, but. It's a nice pattern in the book that you have these sort of islands of earned happiness. I mean, there's a lot of struggle and on that journey, but it really kind of gives a nice rhythm to the book. So one thing that really educated me reading this was the degree to which, and this is, I think, the main achievement of one of the many achievements of the book, is that the Babb is not a peripheral figure, but she's at the center of a literary community. And so I wonder if we could just talk through some of these names that she was connected with. And Dorothy as well was basically had a love affair with Carlos Bolosan, right? The relationship, and has,
she's
a huge.
In America's in the Heart.
Yeah, not named.
But not named, and that is complicated.
Yeah,
why that is.
Right. We could get into that. Sanora knew Bolosan as well, quite well, and I just have the names listed here. William Saroyan, right, is
Yeah.
the kind of the first name that really kind of popped out for me. Maybe you could talk us through her. That wasn't like a
his
major.
papers are here. I got them from
What's
here.
that?
I got his papers from here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
During
Right.
during COVID, the nice librarians,
Oh
research
yeah.
librarians sent
Probably
them to me.
Rebecca Wingfield. Probably.
Yeah. I was really grateful for that.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So what's really fascinating about the William Saroyan story is that they were very close when they were just starting out. Like so many writers were in all of the little magazines, you know, being published all over. And she and Saroyan saw her name in one of the little magazines and like reached out to her and was like, "Hey, I really liked your work. You know, let's correspond." And of course, they started to write to each other. And he immediately like became enamored with her because she was beautiful, but she was brilliant, you know, and their letters back and forth to each other, which are here and at Berkeley, are fascinating, you know, a fascinating literary critique of the time and like what they're reading, and also like helping each other write each other's work. So William Saroyan fell in love with her and ended up like driving down to LA to meet her and asking her to marry him, and she was like, whoa, you know, she wasn't interested in that because she was already seeing Jimmy, and she was also not interested in marrying anyone at that time. But it's interesting that right after that is when William Saroyan gets his break, you know, and it's at that point that he starts telling his literary story. Yeah. Like he erases that era of struggle. And so if you look at any of his biographies, that story of how Sanora Babb really, like, you know, they were very good friends, and for years they were writing to each other. There's all of these wonderful letters, never included in the biographies about Saroyan.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Even though she had this magical impact on him.
She did. She gave him that confidence to like go to New York and pitch his story,
right.
You know,
and she, you know, had a mystical side. I mean, she was a sort of very mystical person, and her charisma and aura come across very well in the book, and it comes across really in this influence that she has on other people as well. Jack Conroy is another name that struck me, right?
He published her in the Anvil.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then they met when, you know, she drove cross country with Tilly Olson and Harry Carlisle. They left from Los Angeles in a little roadster, and the three of them drove cross country. And when they got to Chicago, they went on tours of the factories, right? Because they were going to the 1935, the first Writers' Congress in New York, and Jack Conroy was on those tours with them.
Yeah, and these are all sort of leftist riders, proletarian riders, many of them members of the Communist Party, as was Babb.
But not at that time.
Not at that time. Meridel Lasser as well.
Yes, Meridel Lasser wrote one of my favorite letters to her.
Okay.
Yeah, so she wrote to Babb. She actually encouraged her to go to the 1935 Writers' Congress, to become a delegate, because she saw in Babb's writing this because Babb had done some early reportage about the Hoover Dam, and the way that she approached the story, she brought in the lives of women and children. And Meridel Lasser is like, oh yeah, this is how we need to write. You know, like she's like, I want you to write more shamelessly about women, you know. And she wrote her a couple of letters like that and encouraged her to come to the Congress. And Meridel Lasser was the only woman who spoke at that Congress. So she played a really important role, even though her work also wasn't published in the 1930s.
Right. And Lasser has this experimental side in her writing, right? Like, I mean, she's writing outside of the tradition of sort of socialist realism. I mean, there are aspects of Lasser's work that are more like kind of high modernism, and you get that as well in Babb, right? There's that side to Babb. We'll get into whose names are unknown maybe in a little bit.
Well, just to follow up on that, her novel Girl is just an extraordinary piece of writing. This is Meridel Lasser's novel that she's writing in the 1930s, because it breaks all these gender norms of what a woman could be in a novel. And I think what's important to say is that during the 1930s, so many women were writing novels like that. Like, it was extraordinary, the work that was being produced during that time. And it is only because of the shift that happened, to the Communist Party in the United States because of what was happening in the Soviet Union, that these women got erased after the Red Scare.
Right. Yeah. Tilly Olsen, another name. We have her archives here as well.
Yes, you do.
Right. That was a more fractious relationship with Babb.
It was.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Tilly just approached. So Tilly Olsen was more of a. So Babb was writing about the experiences of people who were, the working poor, from the experience of being the working poor. She knew what it was like. Like, for example, when they were planning their trip to drive cross country, Tilly Olsen came over to her house, and Babb's father had been to visit and left his jacket there, which is this like raggedy black trench coat that was, disgusting, right? Like, and Tilly was like, "Oh, I want to borrow this." And she wore that cross country because she thought it looked authentic. And to Babb, it was like, well, I mean, yeah, it's authentic, but why would you want to wear that if it's not your jacket? Like, that's that idea of performing, the idea of, and I don't think to Tilly Olsen that's what it was. I don't want to condemn Tilly Olsen because I think the work she did was so important.
Yeah,
and she's
from a feminist perspective.
Yes,
definitely.
from a feminist perspective, and it's just. I admire the work that she did. And I do think she's gotten a bad rap in all of the biographies that have been written about her so far. But they did not get along at all. Yeah. They were very different people.
Yeah, I was interested to read that.
Yeah.
I don't want this to become a laundry list of names, but I do think it's worth pointing out, like Richard Wright. She has a, pretty close relationship with him. I mean, more.
You mean Ralph Ellison?
Well, more with Ellison. But
yeah.
I mean, definitely more with Ellison. But I mean, she meets and gets to know Wright a little bit.
Yeah. Right before he becomes famous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Always right before.
It's true though. I mean, she has this.
Same thing with Ralph Ellison. Before she saw early drafts of Invisible Man because they were in a relationship together.
Right. So maybe dwell on Ellison and Ray Bradbury. These are the two names, the sort of the big names.
Yeah.
I missed out Herb Klein, another very important
figure
that she tours the Soviet Union with. Is that right?
Yeah.
Right. But maybe we should stick with Ellison and Bradbury. There's a little passage I'd like to read, if you don't mind, from a letter from Bradbury to Babb, if I can find it. This is Bradbury is writing to Babb about her short story, The Larger Cage. Is that right? I think that's right.
Brilliant short story.
Yeah, and I want to ask you about the short story in a second. And he writes, glanced at the first 2 pages. God, how evocative and beautiful your style is. Do you realize how wonderful you are? And that you should be writing at least 5 pages a day, every day, from now on, and to hell with everything else? When will you buckle down and give us all the Babb work that we all deserve to see? Jesus, that you let a talent like yours get overwhelmed with other jobs and time takers. I wish you would get the hell out of the CQ and work for yourself. It's time you considered yourself, believe me. I mean, an amazing, like the passion in that.
He thought she was one of the best writers that he'd ever encountered.
Yeah.
And they were in a writing group together for over 40 years. So it was something that, it wasn't out of left field. He read everything that she wrote. Like, they would share all of their work together and come together and read their stories aloud to one another, which I like that way of doing it. And then have a conversation about the works on how to improve them.
Yeah. So this is a writing group that lasts for 40 years?
40 years, yeah.
And Bradbury is dedicated to it. Like even
as
when,
his fame skyrockets.
Which it did.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of amazing, that kind of workshop environment and how nurturing that was. And one can only suspect that it was because of her presence within it that it held together.
There's footage of, from the documentaries on Bradbury of their writing group, and it's fascinating to see. And he writes about it in Cat's Pajamas. He writes about one writer's one workshop day that went awry because they started playing songs on the piano and singing and drinking late into the night. But it shows how much they loved one another, as friends. It was like a real, you can see throughout. The reason why I was able to tell Sanora Babb's story is because everybody who was in her literary career loved her because she cared so much about them, and they wanted her story to be told.
Yeah. I mean, another line here from Ralph Ellison, a letter to Babb. Someday I'll get around to telling you just what has been happening to me since I've known you. All that I can say now with certainty is that it was no surface thing. It was no rare holiday, but the start of a new phase in my life, right? Yeah. I mean, again, this pattern of the magical inspiration that she seems to be for so many writers.
Yeah. But so much more than a muse, I think it's important to say, because in the biographies of Ralph Ellison, which only looked at one side of the correspondence, she's kind of looked at as this woman that threw herself at Ralph Ellison, which is not the case. They had an equal relationship, and again, it was very complicated. He was married. Sanora Babb was not married, but she was living with Jimmy. And World War II broke out right when they got together. Yeah. So it was, World War II was already happening. Pearl Harbor was bombed.
Okay, yeah. Right. So, that's right.
The United States entered World War II at that point.
Yeah. And she gave Ellison confidence, and I mean, that comes across.
And it's, at their friend's house, Genevieve Taggart, who lived in Vermont, that's where Ralph Ellison went to write the first draft of Invisible Man. And it was just fascinating. And Genevieve Taggart is another amazing character that we don't know a lot about, who was an important connector of artists, from the leftist artists, who were, especially African-American artists and women artists who were writing during this time period, would go to her house in Vermont and have a place to write. And she was a brilliant poet as well.
Right. And then the final name, and then we'll sort of move on. I want to give some time to the audience to ask questions as well, and you may have other material that you want to present, but I want to end my laundry list of great writers with this guy, B. Traven, is that?
Yeah. B. Traven.
B. Traven. So not everybody, but people might not know who B. Traven is, and maybe you could tell us.
Sure, yeah. He was living in exile in Mexico City, which is where Sanora Babb went to live in exile after, the FBI kept coming to their house in Hollywood, and so in order to not be called to testify, she went to live in Mexico City with her friend.
The dancer.
Yeah, right? Waldine, with Waldine and her husband, Asa. And so when she was living there, she encounters B. Travern, who's this elusive, he says he's B. Travern's agent, that he's not B. Travern, but it turns out that he is. And he's famous for Sierra Madre, the treasure. The treasure of Sierra Madre. Thank you very much.
Which becomes the movie, obviously.
Right, which becomes a movie. But he wrote a great deal about. He didn't just write that story. He wrote many other stories. But he always was somebody that nobody knew who he was, and she became quite close to him when she was living in Mexico City, and connected him to some opportunities through Hollywood, through her connections with Jimmy.
Yeah, so he's this fascinating figure, German. Well, people really don't know. I mean, it's not like Thomas Pynchon, where we know who he is, but we also know he's a recluse, and we don't, it's like we don't even really know who he is, and there's still different theories about who he is, whether he was writing in German or even whether he was writing in English and translating it into German. He was based in Mexico for most of his career. He was connected to the proletariat movement. He, had this. He's a sort of figure of peripheral interest to Americanists. He is very resonant. Her relationship with him sort of brings him into kind of an Americanist global kind of conversation in interesting ways, and she materializes him. Like, she's the only person that, because of this amazing impact that she has and this magical presence, it's like she's the one who realizes who he is and actually discovers him in a sense. I mean, that's incredible.
It is.
So I was really struck by that material because it was kind of new to me. All right, we should finally get to whose names are unknown, but I did want to talk about the short story a little bit because it's one of my interests. I've written on the short story, and
Which is a brilliant short story.
yeah, right. And I think that says a lot. Like, to be a brilliant short story writer, unless you're like Alice Munro or somebody, can mean that you're not necessarily that well known, right? I mean, it's a genre that it doesn't really, it doesn't have the charisma of of the novel in that regard. Yet she was very important in the development of the short story and the teaching of the short story, the pedagogy of the short story, because it is a short story. The short story is a very pedagogical genre, right? Like, it exists in creative writing programs, and it's something that students tend to, first thing they kind of write, and it's this sort of practice genre to some extent, even though it's much more than that, and there's such a long tradition of the short story in American literature. She's published in Best American Short Stories, and she writes like kind of craft essays, I guess you would call them. Does she write a craft?
Yeah, she taught at UCLA, the extension program there, and all of her, while she was doing that, many of her lessons became essays for the writer's craft.
Yeah, well, that's interesting, and I didn't really know any of that. So
all of her lesson plans are at the Harry Ransom Center. It's kind of neat, so you can look at what she taught.
Right, yeah. So I'm thinking of Steinbeck, of course, who also trains in the short story and is taught at Stanford by Edith Miralles, who is one of these, kind of short story gurus.
And you can look in opposition about how they approached short story. I mean, a fascinating essay would be to look at the chrysanthemums against, one of her female protagonists, that is not trapped under the fog of the valley, right? That is able to but to persevere through the oppression that's placed against her as a woman. Yeah,
and often have the stories often feature these moments of transition or development or growth or escape. In a certain way.
They do, and she's not afraid to take on, like a young girl who is in an abusive family. Her father's a gambler. I don't know where she came up with that one, right? But then, showing that girl escaping by jumping on a train and changing her identity actually to a male name, right? Of how women actually lived under all these circumstances in the West. I mean, my first entry into writing about Babb was an essay on her short fiction for Unknown No More, which was a collection of critical essays about her work. Yeah. And so that's where I began understanding her, and it's a wonderful collection of essays, but it was how because I grew up on the short story, as it's one of my favorite genres as well. And to see how she changed the way a female protagonist is perceived in a Western story was really spectacular.
Right, yeah. Yeah, well, thank you. I will look up your essay and read more of her short stories. I really don't know them. So let's end with, I guess, the Steinbeck connection, which, again, for me was fascinating, and her connection with Tom Collins, right? So maybe remind us, I guess, a little bit of who Tom Collins was and her relationship to Collins, and maybe highlight how that was different from Steinbeck's relationship.
Yeah, so Sanora Babb, when she came back from touring around Russia at that time, on that theater tour with Herb Klein, came back and had seen these model farms and thought, oh, this is, I mean, she was seeing everything through the eyes of InTourist, which was the propaganda agency that was making it so that what she saw of the modern farms, of the model farms, looked really appealing to her, right? That women were empowered, that poverty was eradicated, you know, it looked like the best solution to what was happening. And meanwhile, back in Kansas, her mother's sending her these letters about the black blizzards that are happening, and she goes to visit and sees this devastation. And so when she comes back to California from living in England, she says, you know, she realizes this is her novel, that she wants to finish this novel about the Dust Bowl. And she finds a contact for Tom Collins, who is the person who started all of the FSA camps up and down California. And he takes her on as a volunteer, and she works there for 8 months, you know, going up and down the state, getting people off of the, you know, out of the roads and into these facilities so that they can be helped, these democracy-run facilities. And she is somebody, I can show you some pictures of her, like, sitting in, you know, amongst all of the people. Like, she's somebody who integrates herself into these camps, right? She sees these people for who they are because she knows what it's like to starve. She knows what it's like to not be able to get work. She's been in their shoes, and so she understands what it's like, and she's very passionate about connecting with these people. And she records, you know, Tom Collins encourages her to record all of her notes, and she'd stay up at night and work on her manuscript. Ended up sending the first 4 chapters to Random House and getting it accepted. And this is her first book. You know, she's thrilled. Meanwhile, Tom Collins is also working with Steinbeck, and Steinbeck had begun writing the articles about the Dust Bowl in. Usually, I have my notes in front of me. What was the year? What was it?
36. Yeah.
And from
Their Blood is Strong, that become Their Blood is Strong.
No, yeah, 1936, but the San Francisco News, the series of articles he did for them. So he had connected with Tom Collins about that, and ended up visiting the camp a few times. Like on 2 occasions he visited, and he would go and change his identity. So he did not go as John Steinbeck. He went under a different name because he was afraid of the repercussions that he would face from the Associated Farmers, which is understandable. But he did reveal himself to Sanora Babb. And one time when he was visiting, so he had already written 2 versions of his Dust Bowl novel. He'd written The Affair of Lettysburg, and he had written first the Oklahomans and then La Affair Lettysburg, both of which he threw away, much to his agent's chagrin. And that's when he came to visit Tom Collins, and he and Tom Collins and Sanora Babb went out to a cafe, and she willingly shared her notes with Steinbeck, knowing that, and he was in this, like, it was the perfect time for him to receive those notes. Like, he literally left with those notes and ended up in a marathon writing The Grapes of Wrath.
Yeah. So they were like notes that she'd sort of taken them for Collins in a sense, or was working.
Both. She was writing.
But they were her notes.
They were her notes. Yeah.
Yes. And the one thing I guess the one thing I don't get is, like, why couldn't people see the difference between, why couldn't publishers see the difference between
well, let's
this and Grapes of Wrath?
Let's talk about that, because the problem was that Grapes of Wrath came out first. And so, you know, Steinbeck wrote Grapes of Wrath in a marathon, turned it in, it came out, and by June 1939, it had sold over 200,000 copies. Film rights to the book have been sold for $75,000. And Steinbeck was like, his fame was just he was already famous for Of Mice and Men at this point, right? And so it's just skyrocketing. So Bennett Cerf, when he sees this, realizes it's Steinbeck's success, but it's also the fact that when he looks at the readers' reports, right? So they do the readers' reports of her book. And what they realize is the content that Steinbeck has used is so similar to the content that Sanora Babb has used because it is her content. That the second half of their books, as Bennett Cerf says, and I think you must face the fact, just as we did here, the last third of your book is so completely like The Grapes of Wrath that the families and characters might basically be interchanged between the two. So the fact that they were so alike made it so that I think Bennett Cerf thought that that The Grapes of Wrath would eclipse a young novelist who had never published a book before from her book having any success. And when she shopped it around to all the other publishers, they also felt the same way. And so she was not able to publish it. She tried really hard.
Yeah. So even though there were sort of some spin-offs from The Grapes of Wrath, right? Sort of like after Uncle Tom's Cabin, there were sort of...
Yeah, but the spin-offs came later for The Grapes of Wrath.
Okay.
Yeah, the more specific ones came later.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating. It just must have been the really close parallels that they were detecting, right?
Yeah,
that
yeah.
Could have had like legal ramifications as well, I suppose. I don't know. I mean...
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that, yeah, that's a very good question to ask. I don't think that the legal issue was it. I think they just didn't want to bet on a young woman who was writing her first novel, and it looked a lot like Steinbeck's novel, even though she had written hers first.
Right, yeah. Well, we should throw things open to questions, if that's okay, because we're due to end at 6, unfortunately, but we do have some time. Kevin?
Yeah, hi, Kevin Hurl. You acknowledge me.
Yes.
Yeah.
Nice to see you again.
I think you left out, I mean, when you're talking about Steinbeck's role and your question about why it wasn't followed up, is that at a time when books were no longer being banned in the U.S. because there were all the photographs and films of the Nazi book burnings, the reaction to The Grapes of Wrath was about as divergent as the politics of the U.S. are now.
Yeah, that's very true.
And he was attacked. His book was banned. It was the Kern County supervisors voted 4-1 to ban the book. At the time that there was a 600-person waiting list to read the book at the library.
Yeah, so that's part of what his success was too.
But the thing is, what he was attacked for was he was attacked as a Jew, Jewish, which he wasn't, but he was like, no, I don't take any pride in that, but as a communist, which he was not. And she was. I mean, I loved her book. I loved, whose names are unknown. But if they're not going to publish, I mean, if she's never published a book before, and Steinbeck is getting torn to pieces by the Associated Farmers and by conservative outlets around the country, so much so that, I mean, he's also denounced on the floor of the House of Representatives that FDR and Eleanor have to come to his defense and say, no, this is based on truth. Doesn't it make more sense that Random House and Cerf and the other publishers would have avoided it because a first-time author writing a book that's going to get labeled as communist, and she is.
Yeah, she had already joined the party at that point. So yes, that definitely was a factor, and yeah, for sure. That's true. That was a big part of it, and the fact that I mean, your statement that Steinbeck wasn't communist at all, that is something that like came up a great deal in the research, is that he was, before the publication of The Grapes of Wrath, he did identify some with the Communist Party. I think it's important to say that, people were very against his book for other reasons as well, not just political reasons. They felt they were misrepresented by that book.
Other questions for Iris? Yeah. Okay.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the slides you skipped through with all the art.
Oh yeah, let me just show you those a little bit. So, because that has a lot to do with Steinbeck. Because I grew up on Steinbeck and he was my favorite author, let me go back in time. And because my grandmother's story was so intertwined in the story of the Dust Bowl, I felt really afraid to take on a writer like Steinbeck. And so when I was getting on a plane to give a reading at the University of Oklahoma in Norman, I picked up The Grapes of Wrath at the San Francisco airport, and I started rereading it because I had to reread it anyways. And I couldn't stop thinking about my grandmother's voice and my grandmother's stories and the stories that I had heard about what had happened in our family coming over. And as I was doing that, I started erasing The Grapes of Wrath. So what I would do is I would go through and I would write poems about my grandmother, about Sanora Babb, about the misinformation of the story of the West, by borrowing words and mainly letters throughout the text. And I did this over four years that I was writing the book. And as I did it, I did it as an exercise, like a warm-up exercise. And as I didn't think it was actually a piece of art until I was at a residency at the Vermont Studio Center, and a bunch of visual artists came up to me and they were like, well, what are you doing? And I'm like, I'm just doing my warm-up exercise. And they were like, no, you're not, you're making art. And I was like, no, I'm a writer. And they're like, well, actually, you're making art. And so what this became was, once I embraced it as a piece of art, it became a document of all the places I went. For example, that seed pod on that page is from Edna, right outside of Edna St. Vincent Millay's house, where I worked on part of this chapter. And there was the seed pods again. I would enshrine photos of Sanora Babb, or add in, that's Garden City, that's a map of Garden City that were added into, it became record of the places I was going as I empowered myself to write this book. As all my biographies are, it was a dual project between the prose work and a poetic exercise. So this is a book of poems called Endnotes on the West. And it's both this visual version and also printed on the page, just so you can see. Thanks for asking.
We are at 6 o'clock, so I'm going to end the official proceedings and just thank Iris for her time and sharing this wonderful book with us. But I myself have to leave, unfortunately, for another event. But I'm going to leave you maybe to talk a little bit more and to answer some chat with people. If you want to come up and say hi to Iris and ask her questions about the book, I'm sure she would be more than willing to answer them. So,
thank you so much. Thank you.